There are many pathways in contemporary thought that commence or recommence after appearing to have broken off in Balibar's work. Nearly all of them have been important for my own research, not least because I discovered them or discovered a new way of thinking about them thanks to him. Some of these pathways begin at the point of his collaboration with Althusser, while some only appear after, and in certain cases long after, this collaboration had ended. The pathway I want to trace today is not easy to map. It appears to begin during the period of Balibar's collaboration with Althusser, but is perhaps only clear after that in the 1980s. It is the pathway we can identify by the title Citizen Subject. Balibar has from the beginning written this doublet, which has served as the title of an essay published at the end of the 80s, as well as the title of a recent book, without a hyphen to connect its two terms, as if to provoke and then frustrate his reader's desire for a conjunction that would unite citizen and subject. In fact, both the proximity and priority of citizen in relation to subject serve to make visible the contradictory meanings that have been attached to the term subject, reminding us that the subject, and I'm going to refer to the Greek and in solidarity with Stathis yesterday, I too am rejecting the Erasmian pronunciation. Reminding us that the subject as hypokimenon or subjectus signified that which is placed under physically or legally, even as it denoted the substrate or substance from which or upon which other existences might arise, as if its semantic field were the site of a struggle against a perpetually reimposed subjection. Without attempting to construct a genealogy of Balibar's own genealogy of the subject, or citizen subject, we can say that these themes recall, without reproducing or imitating, Althusser's theory of the interpolated subject, the individual to whom agency is imputed so that he may be held accountable for the actions ascribed to him. Perhaps the most decisive and least understood aspect of Althusser's intervention was his insistence on the unbreakable tie between subjectivity or agency and subjection, and therefore on the fact that the subject, in Kant's sense, was not simply the effect of a subjection more profound than itself, as Lacan put it, as if its freedom arose from an original act of submission, but was, as actor or author, the very form of subjection itself. With the partial exception of the posthumously published and still untranslated lectures on psychoanalysis from his seminar of 1963-1964, however, Althusser presented the interpolation of the subject in the form of an allegory, whose effect derived from its abstraction of the drama of the subject from its various settings to present its omni-historical character, related, if in a way that Althusser could not specify, to the omni-historical existence of the unconscious as understood by Freud and Lacan. The risk of such a mode of exposition was that Althusser's theory of ideological subjection could be understood as a combinatory of formal elements, a model he regarded as the site of an idealism that the great works of structuralism did not escape. Further, while the ISA's essay has had enormous influence in the Anglophone world, the formulas concerning the relation between the subject, small s, and subject, capital S, and Althusser's steadfast refusal to say that the subject, capital S, and there's a point at which he says, i.e. God, is the subject of the act of interpolating the subject, small s, even as his formulas suggest precisely the act of calling and calling out, as in the verb kaleo in the Greek of the New Testament, and this remains very enigmatic for Althusser. Perhaps we must also recognize that despite its striking originality, the notion of the interpolation of the individual as subject is also a simplification, albeit a paradoxical simplification, of a theory that did not yet exist, and therefore an anticipatory simplification that risked becoming an obstacle to the very theory whose advent it announced. Balibar's work around the topic of the citizen subject is neither a continuation nor a repudiation of Althusser's scheme. It is instead the product of a recognition that the notion of the subject that emerged not simply from Althusser, but as Etienne said yesterday, from such figures as Lacan and Foucault as well, posed a series of questions and problems that themselves had to be re-examined and perhaps reformulated before they could be answered or resolved. The power of Balibar's work here lies in the extent to which it has pushed the limits of visibility and legibility by insisting precisely on understanding the concepts of subject, subjection, and subjectivity in the historicity of their discursive and textual existence. His approach refuses in principle to treat these concepts as disembodied ideas, abstracted from the complexities of language, that is, specific languages, Latin, French, English, German, but precisely regards them as products of the mutual interaction or interference of multiple languages, and thus also products of the work of translation. His insistence on a discursive and textual materiality that, strictly speaking, renders untranslatable the concepts, phrases, and texts that are, of course, nevertheless translated, compels us to see the way in which the history of the concept of subject is the history of an overdetermined contradiction, of combined and uneven development that imprints upon opposing and apparently incompatible meanings on the word. In the particular case of the term subject, the concept cannot exist except on the basis of this contradiction, on the antagonism proper to it, the trace of subjection against which every form of subjectivity attempts to immunize itself, as if it came into being through the work of compensation. The subject in its modern sense is, as Balibar has shown, a Kantian invention projected back onto Descartes, or more precisely, a nominalization of ego cogito as das Ich denke, or the I think. It is historically linked to a series of related, if not exactly synonymous terms: individual, person, and above all, consciousness. Although, like subject, the term consciousness derives from a Latin translation of a Greek word, the term is a relatively recent invention in English, dating back to the late 17th century, where it was given its full significance only in chapter 27 of part 2 of Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Precisely the focus of Balibar's recent work, Identity and Indifference, Locke and the Invention of Consciousness. This work, I want to argue, has a significance far beyond its interpretation of Locke, and represents a further specification of the genesis of the concept of subject in a double sense. Balibar both demonstrates the function of the concept of consciousness in the emergence of the subject in Kant's sense. The I think must think that it thinks, or must think itself thinking, and describes the role of consciousness in all the complexity that Locke attributes to it in the reproduction of the subjected subject, the simultaneous subjectum subjectus, master, servant of itself. What I want briefly to explore here is perfectly summarized in a two-sentence passage from Locke's essay. Quote, "Could we suppose two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting the same body," and Locke uses act as a transitive verb, and that's a form that's now obsolete in English, but it was quite common. Two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting the same body, the one constantly by day, the other by night, and on the other side, the same consciousness acting by intervals, two distinct bodies. I ask, in the first case, whether the day and the night man would not be two as distinct persons as Socrates and Plato, and I think that's a very strange couple to come up with, but I can't just tell that.
You have to delete that.
Okay, I won't go there. And whether in the second case, there would not be one person in two distinct bodies as much as one man is the same in two distinct clothings, unquote. Let us consider these two alternatives. One, the possibility of a person whose consciousness is so divided that it can no longer be regarded as a single consciousness, and two, the possibility of a single person acting, to use Locke's verb form, two or more distinct bodies, uniting in contrast to the previous example, what Locke will show must remain divided. Far from being a meditation on split, or merely a meditation on split or multiple personalities, on the one hand, and the transmigration of souls, and perhaps demonic possession on the other, these are the unasked questions whose response constitutes what Althusser called une évidence, like cette évidence que vous et moi sommes des sujets. Locke's text, even more than those of Hobbes, might be understood as a form of primitive accumulation in theory, which frees up individuals from the ties as well as the entanglements of social existence, the confusion of affects, desires, and identities that stood in the way of the partitioning of human action. The operation of consciousness as a concept is here. Consciousness guarantees the unity of the individual both with, quote, his own thought, unquote, so that there can be no other within, and with the organization of that body that he calls his own, so that by means of the notion of the vital unity of thought and body, Locke ensures that the individual cannot feel or think what others feel or think. Consciousness, Balibar constantly reminds us, is the perception of what passes not simply in a man's mind, but in a man's own mind. That's the phrase that Locke repeats. As if Locke, by means of the adjective own, both acknowledges and rules out the possibility that there may pass through a man's mind something, a feeling, an idea that isn't his or his own, but has infiltrated his consciousness, an affect disguised as his, but which properly belongs to another. The function of consciousness is thus to distinguish the individual and what is his own, what is proper to him, that is his property, clearly, or as Locke will put it, forensically, from all other individuals in order that he may be a, quote, person possessed of his own legal personality and thus liable, that's the forensic side, for what he and he alone has done. As Balibar has shown, the term consciousness as employed by Locke, that is not simply self-awareness, which was a usage already well established in Locke's time, but a faculty essentially united to thought itself and necessary to the individuation characteristic of the human species, was an invention. To understand its semantic specificity requires a review of a long and complicated history of translation, transmission, and transformation. Perhaps most significantly, the term consciousness is marked by a forgetting, precisely the objective forgetting that does not take place in consciousness through a fault, lack, or failure, but a forgetting internal to the discourse that precedes it, as if consciousness emerges as a concept only on the basis of a refusal or exclusion of another meaning or meanings. Both consciousness and conscience in English are derived from the Latin term conscientia, which is in turn derived from the Greek syneidesis. The statistically predominant sense of both the Greek and Latin terms is that of a shared knowledge. The Latin prefix con or com, like the Greek sin or sim, denotes a shared or common experience. The Greek synedon means to see together, that is to see the same thing as others, and by extension to know what others know. Thus, while for Locke the individual could be conscious only of what passed in his own mind, the Greek and Latin terms suggest that consciousness, in the full sense of the term, cannot be restricted to one's own self, but is finally a trans-individual experience. Liddell and Scott, that's the dictionary, defines the Greek syneidesis as, quote, a being privy to, unquote, which even as it suggests that some individuals are deprived of the knowledge in question, is also a sharing in what is not common knowledge. It was perhaps only with the beginnings of Christianity that the noun syneidesis took on the meaning of an individualization or interiorization of a shared knowledge, something like the application of a shared knowledge by an individual to himself in the form of self-judgment. The works attributed to Paul, for example, above all Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, clearly represent a contraction or redirection of the term, such that the implication of knowing with is limited to the relation between the individual and God and concerns moral and religious doctrine rather than knowledge in a general sense. Commentators have often associated this semantic shift with Paul's rejection of the law and outward bodily obedience in favor of an internal obedience to God no longer visible to others, whose judgments would carry no weight on the great day when hearts shall be laid bare and God alone will judge. Similarly, in the Latin world, the term conscientia shifted from a designation of a knowing with others to a sense internal to the individual, which enabled him to scrutinize himself and above all to submit his thought to a foro interno, or internal tribunal. The English term conscience by the 17th century had been emptied of any reference to the horizontality of a knowing with or a seeing at the same time. Perhaps the polemics associated with the Reformation, particularly with Luther, had contributed to a refashioning of the concept of conscience, such that the collective prefix of the German Gewissen, as in the English conscience, had become purely vestigial. Henceforth, conscience would be understood as the individual's relation to himself, mediated by God or through the law that God has inscribed in every heart. It has become that essential part of every human being which others precisely cannot know or judge, as if the solitary individual were abandoned by his fellows before God. As Balibar has shown, Locke might simply have retained the term conscience, by its time, as I said, very well established in the lexicon of English, as in French and Spanish, exploiting and even recovering some of the meanings of conscientia as it was used by Cicero and others, particularly the meaning of self-scrutiny, according to some commentators, involving reading the prefix con as if it were a reflexive form, something like self-knowledge. Why would Locke choose instead to employ a term, and to do so systematically, that had been used in the sense he uses it no more than half a dozen times before him? Balibar has analyzed in detail the enormous difficulty Locke's decision caused his French translator as he sought to supply a French equivalent. Apart from the fact that by the 17th century, conscience had a far more limited semantic range in English than conscience in French, there existed difficulties that the notion of conscience not only did not address, but in fact aggravated. Accordingly, we may understand Locke's introduction of the term consciousness as a means of solving two but unequally developed problems. One, the very notion of conscience suggested that there were at least two divergent and typically opposed wills in every individual: the will to sin and the will to obey God. Is it the same man, which of these wills could justifiably be said to pertain to the individual in question? Is it the same man, or perhaps more precisely the same person, who wills himself to sin and simultaneously to obey God? Locke formulates the problem in apparently less Christian terms, terms which he again calls forensic. If a man, when drunk, that is so drunk he cannot later remember what he said or did, or at least, and Locke is very careful about this, says that he cannot remember, okay? Or if a man is asleep and commits a crime, sounds rather strange, but sleepwalking was a very fascinating phenomenon for the 17th century. So if a man drunk or sleeping violates the law, can the act said to be performed by the same man the individual is when sober or awake? In part, this is a question of what Locke calls identity. Quote, the identity of the same man consists in nothing but a participation of the same continued life by constantly fleeting particles of matter in succession vitally united to the same organized body, unquote. But this only tells us that his bodily substance, whose identity lies not in the continuity of its parts, but in its organization or composition, is the same. As Locke says, the body as well as the soul goes to the making of a man, unquote. Even if we can rule out a transmigration of souls that would allow, as Locke puts it, Socrates to live on in a succession of different bodies, is what answers to a proper name and is vitally united to an organized body necessarily one and the same person. Indeed, is a man who answers to one name, one of the marks of his identity, the same person when sane and when mad? Are, quote, his actions, unquote, when mad, really his own? And can he be said to be responsible both causally and legally for them because these actions were carried out by the same body? Here, the problem is that of the threat of a multiplicity and a diversity internal to the individual, or at least the individual body present to the senses of others, which would make it impossible to answer a simple question like, who is responsible for this? Locke's solution lies in the concept of consciousness. As we said, the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. Now we begin to see why the own is there. For Locke, this perception is, quote, inseparable from thinking, and as it seems to me, essential to it, unquote. When we perceive something, we, in one and the same act, perceive that we perceive. When we think, we know that we think, or think that we think. This doubling or duplication is necessary given that, quote, to suppose the soul to think and the man not to perceive it is to make two persons in one man, unquote. The fact that we always and necessarily perceive that we perceive and know that we know, Locke argues, means that, quote, everyone is to himself that which he calls self. It is consciousness that unifies past and present thoughts and imposes a sufficient degree of unity and continuity to refer all that passes in a man's own mind to the single person who corresponds to the pronoun I. And if we have any doubts about the urgency with which Locke repeatedly returns to the question of the unity of personal identity, he will argue that, quote, punishment is annexed to personality and personality to consciousness, unquote, even in the case of the drunkard who upon awakening has no consciousness of having committed a crime. It is just, he argues, to punish such a man, quote, because the fact is proved against him. That is, we all saw him do that. But the want of consciousness cannot be proved for him, unquote. No one can show that he isn't faking it, as we say, right? Thus, if each person knows that he himself knows, he cannot thereby know that anyone other than himself knows or knows that he knows. If the body is an essential part of the man for Locke, it is because the body is perceived by others as that to which consciousness and thus legal and moral personality may be imputed or ascribed. If the man who while drunk or sleepwalking commits a crime without any thought or consciousness of that thought, the very inaccessibility of consciousness necessitates the supposition, which Locke freely admits may be mistaken, of responsibility, because no one other than himself participates in the consciousness of what passes in a man's mind. It is impossible to know whether or not, when he says he has no conscious recollection of the action in question, he is telling the truth. But if a man can deceive others about what has passed in his mind, can he deceive himself? And who in such a case would seek to deceive, on the one one side and be deceived on the other. In a sense, everything Locke says in chapter 27 of part 2 is designed to exclude such a possibility, even as the work of exclusion seems to pose increasingly difficult questions to itself. It is here that what Balibar has called a topography of the subject arises as a kind of solution to the problem. Personal identity emerges not simply from the fact that an individual thinks, but from the fact that he observes that he thinks in what Locke calls self-consciousness. But the very fact that he appropriates his word, his thought to himself, precisely by affirming that it is his own and no one else's, renders it inaccessible to the knowledge and judgment of others. The presumption of guilt in the case of the drunken man or the sleepwalker who commits a crime, a presumption made necessary by the fact that we can't know what other people are thinking or what they're conscious of. And in his capacity, the man who, in his capacity as the sole witness to his intentions, cannot be expected to testify against himself, calls the very notion of justice into question, apparently by punishing the innocent along with the guilty. As a solution to the problems that arise from what he calls the incommunicability of individuals' minds, and the difficulty, perhaps the impossibility, of determining intent, as we put it today, Locke is thus compelled to furnish a transcendental position from which the contents of every consciousness are visible. There will come, he tells us, quote, a great day wherein the secrets of all hearts shall be open, unquote, to be seen and then judged by God, who will recognize and reward the innocent, who within the limits of human knowledge were nevertheless rightly judged guilty. That is, you'll get your reward later, even if you're punished in the present. Yeah, almost. The person thus defined must not only know that he knows, he must know that he is or will be known when his heart is, quote, laid open, when the inner becomes outer, and that which is concealed becomes known by someone or something else. We live thus by observing ourselves, but knowing that we are or will be in turn observed, visible without the possibility of concealment. The observer knows himself being observed. As Balibar has noted, quote, for Locke, the truth of consciousness, or self-consciousness, and that of absolute judgment, freed from the veils that language and communication impose, constitute one and the same problem, that of the last instance of judgment. It is possible to take this as a kind of myth, but it would be more accurate to see in it an ideality, precisely the ideality that Locke, through the concatenation of the terms consciousness, memory, identity, self, responsibility, and judgment, seeks to place at the limit of his theory of mind, unquote. In this topography, the person visible to himself, but concealed from other persons around him, must know that he is visible from above, so to speak, and will be judged for eternity on the basis of all he has ever thought or done, even that which, having been forgotten, may remain unknown in the present to himself. All will be revealed to him, however, at the moment he is judged. And although I said judged by God a minute ago, Locke doesn't say judged by God. He uses the passive voice and simply says he will be judged. And that's it. Okay? As if to emphasize the judgment rather than the judge, rendering it strangely impersonal, as if consciousness comprehends all that is known in the last instance, understood both logically and chronologically, the instance of judgment in which all is laid bare. Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, whose significance Foucault articulated with such lucidity, was perhaps nothing more than a kind of allegorical figure of Locke's topographical scheme, of the subject who knows himself knowing and knows that he will be known at the moment he is summoned to judgment. We are in this way reminded that Locke's person is indeed a subjective being, even if his subjection appears to take the form of a self-subjection, as if he were endowed with consciousness in order to be liable to judgment both here and now and, secondly, on the great day to come. It is not enough that he sees and knows himself, but Locke must postulate the fact that he is seeing himself, knowing himself. For only in this last instance, as Balibar calls it, can he both know all that his consciousness has perceived, including what he may have forgotten, and know that he knows. It is this self-knowledge that is revealed in its totality only on the day of judgment, and it is this for which the person will be called to account. But just as we cannot suppose two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting the same body, the one constantly by day, the other by night, so we cannot suppose the same consciousness acting by intervals two distinct bodies. This highlights the importance of the body for Locke. Consciousness acts the body that vitally united to it, as he puts it, is its own. The body retains its identity not because it is made up of the same particles of matter, but because the consciousness of the body's action, but because consciousness of the body's actions vitally unites the body to the rational spirit, as Locke calls it, allowing us to speak of the same man. In this way, Locke is able to tie the self to a single body, thus rendering the body the means of separation and individuation. Quote, the body as well as the soul goes to the making of a man, and thus we may be able without any difficulty to conceive the same person at the resurrection, though in a body not exactly in make or parts the same which he had here, the same consciousness going along with the soul that inhabits it. Yet the soul alone, in the change of bodies, would scarce to anyone but to him that makes the soul the man be enough to make the same man. We can talk more. The reference here to resurrection is crucial. The individual knows and knows that he knows only the actions of his own body. The body that, in Locke's words, is acted by its consciousness, which is held accountable on Judgment Day. Quote, the sentence shall be justified by the consciousness all persons shall have, that they themselves, in what body soever they appear, or what substances soever that consciousness adheres to, are the same that committed those actions and deserve that punishment for them, unquote. The separation of bodies here is the condition of the separation of consciousnesses, which in turn guarantees the separation of persons for forensic purposes. I am aware of what happens in my own body and no one else's, just as no one else can be conscious of what happens in my body. No one can feel my pain or pleasure, my ease or uneasiness of body. There can be no mingling or sharing between consciousnesses. The separation is absolute. If one were, quote, to find himself consciousness of any of the actions of Nestor, he then finds himself the same person with Nestor, unquote. Here Locke stands in opposition to his contemporary Spinoza and Malebranche, for whom one of the most powerful forces in social and political life was the imitation or contagion, that is, reproduction or transmission of affects between individuals. For them, passions and images pass so freely between persons that the question of whether what passes in my own mind is mine or somebody else's became an insoluble problem, calling into question the very notion of a man's own mind, and thus the proprietary relation between me and what I call mine or my own. As Balibar notes, the thematic of the own, owning, and ownership entails a parallelism of responsibility and property, of self-consciousness and property in oneself, unquote. At this point, we may begin to see that the importance of the body extends beyond the guarantee it provides of the separation of consciousness, and therefore of persons. The body is not simply an object in space, it is an animate and therefore living thing, a fact that opens the way to what we might call the biopolitical dimension of Locke's philosophy. Indeed, it is possible to argue that contrary to appearances, the doctrine of property, developed in the first 5 chapters of the Second Treatise of Government, logically precedes, that is, forms the theoretical conditions of possibility of the concept of personal identity Locke elucidates in chapter 27 of part 2 of the essay. For if my ownership of the body I act, in both senses of own, I acknowledge its actions mine, and I am their proprietor, is the foundation of all subsequent appropriation, and Locke will make frequent use of the term annexation to describe the act of appropriation. The condition of such ownership is the continued life of the body, without which there can be no consciousness, no self, no person. It is this fact that gives primacy to what we might call the act of living, not simply the involuntary movements of respiration or the circulation of blood, but those voluntary actions by which an individual procures the nourishment and shelter without which the body cannot remain animate. Okay, I have to stop, but yeah, I'm going to stop.
Oh.
I had a really good ending.
Well, I'll give you the opportunity to tell us it now.
No.
Because I have a question regarding it. So. Actually, if I was given the privilege of asking the first question, so I had two questions. Whether there's a way of using your work and the reading of Locke, whether there's a way of de-theologizing this fractured subject and re-politicizing it, so that the fractures and conflicts in consciousness start to involve more than one mind again. I was thinking of your notion of estrangement or strangerhood last night, that there would be a way, because with the theologization of the story, which by the way is totally fascinating, is you're always actually engaging with some notion above, namely God. And in a way, this own mind is always doubled by the presence of something above in this theological picture. So I thought in the repoliticizing of the topic, again into the modern subject, which is how you end your essay, whether one wouldn't want to then re-invoke the other mind to explain those fractures that you've described here. So that would be my question, which allows you to tell us the end of your paper.
But no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's very important to read Locke, as I tried to suggest, as engaged in the work of a kind of defense against the notions of shared experience, of a common experience, in part to found the possibility of this forensic determination. But I think the question of the topographical, as Etienne likes to call it, I think it's very difficult for Locke to let go of that in a certain way, because it's not simply, I mean, he gets himself into a sort of impasse, so that if he's closed out the individual to such an extent from others, no one can know what's in my mind, that without the mediation of the last instance, although perhaps as somebody once said, the lonely hour of the last instance never comes. That may be the case, because it's a purely, as I said, I don't think it's a matter of...
But it's closeness that only works on a theological picture, where eventually there's a God who does see.
But I think it's the opposite. I think it's a sense of mind, or let's say consciousness, that requires the postulation of this transcendental instance.
Exactly.
Which in some way, doesn't have to be God. I mean, because we're very close to Kant, certainly.
Yeah, sure, exactly.
But he can't do without that transcendental position. If he doesn't have that, then we end up with the solipsism of the lady, which is an absurd...
That I agree with. For Locke, that's the case. And so while I was wondering whether with your work, engaging with Locke and you engaging with it, that you could repoliticize it and detheologize it, so this transcendental presupposition gets reformulated to do political work as opposed to...
Well, you don't have to go very far. You don't even have to read Locke's moment, because there was a fellow born the same year as Locke by the name of Spinoza. Spinoza, that's how you need to know. And Spinoza had, I mean, I mentioned Malebranche as well, but in Locke, there's very little evidence about Locke's knowledge of Spinoza, but Locke certainly knew Malebranche very, very well, and wrote a critique of him, etc. But for Spinoza, and to some extent in Malebranche, in the search for truth, there's a completely different idea of consciousness, which is not really a term that either one uses, but let's say of mind or something like that. It's permeable. It's not even in principle separable from other people. And I think that is indeed the foundation for a very different politics on Spinoza's part.
You had a question?
Yes, I should just shout.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you began by juxtaposing the duplicity of conscience to the unicity of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then problematize that, I take it, insofar as consciousness only exists insofar as one is conscious of it. So consciousness presupposes self-consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, then, the unicity of consciousness is founded on internal duplicity, at least for the recognition of its own existence.
Okay, but when you say unicity, I think there's a bit of a problem, because the unicity for Locke is absolutely not in the fact of consciousness itself.
It's in
The unicity is I'm quoting him, the vital unity, okay, between consciousness and its body, so that you can't separate, even at the resurrection. That's why I said that. Even at the resurrection, there is present a body. So the unicity is not within consciousness itself, or even self-consciousness, or etc. It's the relation between consciousness and its body, without which his entire scheme falls apart.
Right, but my question was actually more about self-consciousness,
Okay.
Rather than the relationship between consciousness and the body. And that is that, as you described it, consciousness, in order for us to be aware of its very existence, presupposes a self-consciousness.
Yeah.
In that sense, doesn't Locke run the risk of a kind of slippery slope argument, insofar as the very awareness of self-consciousness would presuppose a third-order awareness of self-consciousness being aware of consciousness? And in fact, that's precisely what Locke himself does in explaining the relationship between.
But I don't think that's
consciousness
no.
and
I think he does that, and I think you could in principle multiply it not to infinity, but all the way. And I'm using typographical, all the way up to the last instance, which is it's a good phrase, which is absolute knowledge, absolute consciousness, etc. Because I don't think for him, I was initially going to divide this into the vertical and the horizontal. The vertical duplication, multiplication of levels of consciousness is not a problem, as long as there is no contact with other consciousnesses. That's the key. He has no problem multiplying awareness of awareness of awareness all the way up to God.
But then in that case, you absolutely need God in order to
That's
stop the chain of
That's
infinite
right.
regression, because otherwise you fall into a kind of classic third man argument.
You
in which
could.
You always need.
You could, or on the other side, it's still internal because of the body to the person, and this is where his terms become complicated. And so without God, there's an enormous problem of solipsism and etc. So I think it's absolutely right. You must have God for a number of reasons, both as an endpoint, hypothetical endpoint, the absolute in which everything becomes known, and then it's also because consciousness, even though he doesn't want to say this, doesn't remember everything. It forgets. They forget everything. But I think, and there are other reasons as well.
Yes, since yesterday, in fact, since the lecture of Etienne and the objection of Hugo, and now your talk, Ron, I think about the unconscious, in fact. And I think about the sentence of Lacan, l'inconscience et la politique. Conscious is politics. My hypothesis should be that...
Where is that?
I can't.
Attributed to Lacan.
Yeah.
It's online.
Say that somewhere.
Go ahead.
And it's not me. I swear I didn't create it. And it would be a sort of an interpretation of psychoanalysis as a way to say that the unconscious could be understood as a way to reintroduce the community, the plurality in the subject. You spoke about that God thing, in fact. And it could be a sort of interpretation of the unconscious as the trans-individual entity. And I was thinking about Nancy. Do not ask me where he brought that, because I can't remember, but he brought somewhere, or he said somewhere, or maybe Lacan said somewhere, that the unconscious is the world. And it is, so my hypothesis would be that, because second, it is a way to come back to what Etienne said yesterday. I was thinking about this word étrangèreté. Etienne said that. I was thinking, I don't remember if you wanted to speak about the Entfremdung, or if you wanted to speak about the unheimliche side of the subject. And so, because the stranger could be also a way to speak about the unconscious, and that is to say the repressed side of the subject. And it would be also a way to think about the objection of...
Sorry, 10th of May, 1967.
Oh, that's okay, I didn't know. You thought
There's no longer any privacy.
No.
No, can I stop there? Because I was thinking that in a way the unconscious is in fact prior to the subject, but as the unconscious is something repressed, the subject appears as the beginning, but in fact the subject is the second beginning. It's a beginning based on the repression of the inside strangeness. Okay, it's about that, about the objections.
I mean, no, I think that's right. I think at the same time, though, that Locke separates even those two questions. One, which is it possible that there are two persons in my mind linked to my body? Okay, from the question, which is another form, it has a more political dimension directly, of a single consciousness acting two bodies, three mini bodies, in other words, some sort of ingenium, Spinoza would say, etc. But I think that in the first case, which is really what you're talking about, that is, I think Locke is haunted by a fear that, the day man and the night man, that there could be an other inside me. But I think he's trying desperately to separate that from, it's not, I wouldn't exactly say it's Lacan, but it's a model of intersubjectivity. It's a model that Lacan, in fact, is relatively critical of, what he called the phenomenologic, Lagache, had a model of the other within me, etc. And I think, okay, Locke is afraid of something like that, but I think it's more complicated than a phenomenological model of intersubjectivity. What he's afraid of is not exactly that, but it's sort of splitting of the individual into a number of individuals. That is, that unity that you must have for forensic purposes, which is literal, okay, cannot be found. He's desperately trying to find the punishable individual to be held responsible. Because if you even say, I didn't know what I was doing or something, it doesn't doesn't matter, and we'll punish you, and even if you really didn't know, that's okay, because, at the end of the day, you'll be found innocent. The reward there is much greater than anything you can do.
Well, I've had a note to end this session.
We just hear the painting.
No.
So,
I thought we no longer had time, so I just wanted to.
oh, please, you have the last word.
No, because this would be all these questions, your question, Gabriel's questions, Lydia's questions, and your extraordinary essay, in which I have a feeling that you are on the way of solving something that remained a puzzle or an obstacle for me. I can work on that, which dates back 20 years. It is recently published in English, and I'm delighted with that, because also my colleague and friend Stella Sanford added remarkable introduction, because you made a translation that makes it a different text. And because it gave me the opportunity to add a piece on Spinoza and Locke, which, for the reasons you indicated, and so on. But all this being said, it's just a silly reaction to your last phrase. There certainly are many things Locke would have been afraid of. But the more I was reading, and this discussion I believe showed the same, the more I was admirative and stunned, not only by his philosophical genius, but by the fact that he was not afraid of addressing the things he might have been afraid of, such as precisely unwanted communication between consciousnesses, uneasy effects of the relationship to the body, which maybe are not entirely reducible to ownership of the actions of that body, and reduplication, internal reduplication of self-consciousness, a word he uses only once. I thought I was able to indicate that this was, of course, in leading to the core of his argument and paving the way, of course, for every subsequent reflections on self-consciousness, but barred, so to speak, from becoming commonly used by him in his text, as consciousness became a theological obstacles at the time. And so bringing back, of course, the question that Gabriel addressed, whether I would say the vanishing duplicity that characterizes consciousness in the quasi-phenomenological description that he gives of it, organized around perception and sensation, in the end, of course, produces something like a transcendent ego. I mean, he's, to use Sartre's title, I think he's struggling to keep an immanence of the ego instead of a transcendence of the ego, but that's on the margin. And again, I'm admirative and stunned by the fact that what he's afraid in different senses, politically, intellectually, passionately, and so on, he doesn't suppress, but he makes it the core of his argument. I mean, this is about 2/3 of the chapter that contemporary philosophers, these excellent analytical philosophers, are never discussing. All the counterfactuals, all the thought experiments, and of course, as a consequence, also the literary dimension of the text. This is entirely left aside for the sake of the narrow reconstruction of one supposedly circular argument in Locke's text. And of course, after that, they are forced to retrieve all that in their own manner, and you get Moffat is already in Locke, and with exactly the same kind of analytical rigor, because he's not afraid of addressing these issues, etc. And that's okay. That's all I wanted to say.
I couldn't agree with you more. So thank you very much.